Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our new webinar series, Smarter Together. Today's webinar is the fifth in this new series hosted by Georgia Tech's Smart Cities and Inclusive Innovation team. My name is Greg McCormick. I'm the director of the Georgia Smart Communities Challenge, a grant program offered through the Smart Cities and Inclusive Innovation Group. The grant is available to local communities in Georgia and provides funding and technical assistance through a research partnership with a Georgia Tech research professor for a year-long pilot study or project in smart community technology. Interested communities should please submit a proposal by next Friday, June 12th. Information can be found on our website. A few housekeeping reminders before we get started today. Please keep your audio and your video muted throughout the presentation to limit interruptions. If you'd like to ask questions, you can do so through the chat area found here in BlueJeans. We will be monitoring that chat area throughout the presentation, so you can submit your question at any time. All questions will be taken after the three presenters give their brief presentations, and we go into a panel discussion where we take your questions from the audience. We are recording today's presentations and panel discussion, and that will be available on our website later this afternoon for later viewing. The slides from the presenters will also be available for download and viewing at later time. So again, I'd like to welcome you all today to Smarter Together webinar. We're very happy to have with us some individuals from Georgia Tech, as well as our local community, and even an individual from the U.S. federal government and NIST to present on democratizing connectivity. So I'd first like to introduce Ada Gavrilovska, who's an associate professor in the College of Computing at Georgia Tech. Then Ellen Zegura, who's a Fleming professor also in the College of Computing at Georgia Tech. Julie Walker joined us. She's a state librarian and associate vice chancellor for libraries in the University System of Georgia. And then our moderator for our panel discussion is Sokwoo Rhee. He's the associate director for innovation at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. So thank you all for joining us today. The presenters will be giving a brief presentation, and then we'll go into a Q&A panel discussion after that. So Ada, welcome, and you can start.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Good. So this will be a little bit different, presenting and having somebody else go through the slides for you. So it's a first. I thank you for inviting me, Greg and Deborah, and the Smart City Institute. I knew I will go first, so I will start by giving a little bit of just context of why are we really talking about this topic, democratizing connectivity. So next, please. One of the things that we're all aware of, we've all seen charts like these. These are from the Cisco Virtual Network Index report, and we see a continuous trend in increase in number of devices, an increase in amount of data that gets consumed by all of the devices, the bandwidth that data consumes. Particularly, one of the interesting things is that the wireless portion of that bandwidth continues to grow. Now, what's also very interesting is, if you go to the next slide, is that in addition to this just plain increase in demand, and particularly in wireless connectivity, is that we're also seeing a shift in the kinds of applications we have. So we're still seeing video, but we're seeing high definition video. So our individual connection or individual device is consuming much more bandwidth in that, of using that application. We're also seeing new types of workloads that are emerging, like this broadly called extended reality, AR, VR. They need both bandwidth, but they also need latency, right? Which is not the same kind of requirement as what, for instance, we have with some other type of content. And then we have a number of new applications that are coming kind of in the broader context of smart city, automation in general, which maybe don't have as stringent per connection bandwidth requirements. Actually, they may have quite low, but their latency requirements are going to be very, very critical. And now if you go to the next slide, we have an even more evidence of changes in the demand that we see with respect to connectivity, given what's happening these days to all of us, kind of our new normal. So this map on the left-hand side, I tried to find a similar one from Georgia, but this map is from the Bay Area. And what it shows is change in connections, in internet traffic, and IT demand in general. And the red areas show a significant drop, and the green areas show increase. We're kind of used to have green kind of increase and red decrease, so not necessarily here the good kind of change. But this will a lot of this will stay. And if we look at the graph below, this graph shows a typical internet usage pattern on a campus. And so the purple line is a weekend, and whereas we would have expected Monday the same things to happen again, that Monday is March 16th, and we just have a bump in the wire. And the thing is, this is not just about how we watch videos, how we play games. This is the connectivity that we need in this new normal is not just about infotainment. It's about critical services that we need: access to medicine, access to livelihood, access to education. This is my daughter for one more day. This is her second grade classroom. School's over for her tomorrow, and this is how we function. And so it's beyond just about infotainment. It's much more critical and much more broadly critical. So how do we normally respond when we have a demand for something, right? If we go to the next slide, so as a technologist, one normal response, one obvious response is, well, we're going to come up with the next generation technology, right? And so sort of 5G is in various stages and timelines of becoming available, and that will address some of these challenges, but only somewhere, and only for some communities, only sometime. If we look at this graph on the right-hand side, the upper graph, today we have a mix of technologies. We've always had a mix of 2G, 3G, 4G technologies, and this will continue to be the trend. And so 5G is not going to be the answer to all of the problems and all of the challenges with respect to connectivity that we see. It's going to require a lot of investment. The map below is a map of where connectivity is, where gaps, or how adequate the connectivity currently is. And I know that Ellen will talk more about this, probably Julie too, but everything that's gray on this map, it means that it's like the connectivity is below something that's considered an adequate level. Right. And actually, it's not maybe even an adequate, but it's the FCC minimum standard. So clearly, we haven't gotten to address this with the current mix of technologies, and the investment that's going to be necessary for 5G to address broadly the connectivity problems is going to be significant. Okay, so what else can we do? So if we go to the next slide, the other thing that, again, as technologies we know how to do well is, well, we're just going to make sure that we kind of push toward commoditization of technology. That always changes the price point of technology, the accessibility of technology, makes it more broadly and more easily available, and that can help address a lot of things. And with respect to connectivity, there's been, I think, a lot of change over recent years with that respect. Whereas I think kind of traditionally, this was more of a mix of proprietary technologies driven by the connectivity providers industry broadly, mobile operators in particular. We see different kinds of trends happening today. So what are some of the things that I've tried to portray here in this slide? So from the hardware perspective, we have this thing called the Open Compute Project, which tries to assemble kind of specs on reference implementations for different hardware components that can be useful for various things, from data centers to different types of technologies. And within this Open Compute Project initiatives, there's specs that are driven around telco hardware, right? So this can be a useful piece of information to use kind of how to build more easily, how to develop more easily platforms that can be used to provide additional connectivity. There is an open initiative, pretty much all of the different standardization bodies and organizations, various consortiums are offering certain things. But what I've illustrated here is this Ether initiative that's essentially a 5G LTE connectivity as a service. And there are a number of companies behind it, a number of organizations behind it. It's pushed by the Open Networking Forum. There are software stacks available through Etsy, through the Linux Foundation. So there's a lot that's readily available. The one that's on the right-hand side, that's sort of a relatively recent referenced implementation, currently for LTE only. So this is from Facebook. It's called the Magma Project. The promise is several of these open source implementations are promising sort of this fall and forward to expect 5G technologies. Kind of currently what's available is up to LTE, but there are a lot of easily accessible technologies that can be used for communities, for organizations to actually build solutions themselves. And this is the figure here. This map is an interesting project that was presented at a recent conference about such an initiative to build sort of a ground-up network in Indonesia, and to basically serve communities that otherwise did not have access to mobile connectivity. And then if you go to the next slide, the other thing that we typically do as technologists when there is a bottleneck for some type of resource and when we're running out of options is to basically trade one resource, the demand for one resource, and solve that by throwing at it another resource. So, building 5G networks is expensive. Building networks in general is expensive, but servers are cheap, relatively, right? Storage is cheap. So this has given rise to what we kind of formally call now edge computing, or mobile edge computing, or multi-access edge computing. So it's not to kind of refer just to the mobile network operators, but also to other maybe enterprise solutions. And that's what it means. It means we're going to put servers somewhere in the access points of the networks. And then, as opposed to running applications just in remote data centers and in clouds, we're going to take those applications and bring them on these servers in the edge. And so, maybe this is where, Zoom will create some edge application that will run there. Maybe Seesaw, which is sort of the go-to application that's used in schools for this virtual learning, connected cars. Chick-fil-A, surprisingly, other than having the best chicken nuggets in town, also has a edge computing lab. And they have this sort of mini data center that's in their data centers that controls, from monitoring, not just over the restaurant and dealing with orders, but actually monitoring the cooking process of those chicken nuggets. And edge computing is interesting, is important because it both deals with the bandwidth problems that we have, right? The bandwidth pressure that all of these new applications and usage patterns are creating, that now we don't have to push everything to the data centers. But also it helps deliver latency. So even, no matter how much money we have to throw more bandwidth at a problem, there is a speed of light limit. And our data center, if it's far, it's going to take time for data to reach that data center. And this graph on the right-hand side, these circles, they list many different applications that have different latency requirements. And that uppermost circles has applications like interactive AR, VR, like driving automation, like a lot of cognitive type of applications. And those, we're going to have to meet them with something like edge compute. If you go to the next slide, where we can kind of easily ask the question, is this something new? I mean, haven't we had CDNs, and aren't all the video content providers coming up with some solutions where they co-locate servers in sort of the central offices in edge locations? And yes, that's true, but across all of these different examples of what we have as an edge today, we have something on the order of, if you go to the next slide, it's kind of a mini animation. We have something on the order of kind of couple of thousand locations, 2-3 types of locations. Maybe the number of servers is non-trivial, but the number of locations is far. And so, this is never going to address all of the latency requirements. This is never going to solve all of the sort of tiny, smaller community problems that, that we would like to address. And just to put this in contrast, if you go to the next slide, we have what if we look at what the mobile networks looks like. I don't think there are dots here. Can you try to see if you can go one slide forward? I don't know why this came out like that. Or maybe it just takes time. No, you can just go back. So these maps were supposed to have tiny little red dots, and to show the locations of the cellular towers and central offices of the mobile network operators. And these dots were going to be populated in different places of these maps, but they were going to show us that just if we look at the US, we have 1 or 2 orders of magnitude more of these opportunities, kind of where to put compute infrastructure and to address some of these problems with that can help address some of these problems with connectivity. And industry is recognizing this, and so the next slide just shows like few clippings of media announcements about initiatives, partnerships between telco providers and cloud operators to come together and try to solve this problem. So my group on the next slide, what we're working on primarily is we're working in the area of edge computing. And we're working on system software. I'm a system software person, so we're working on system software for edge computing. There are a lot of opportunities with edge computing to run different workloads, but we're going to need some new solutions and not the same ones as in the cloud, both from how to deal with latency guarantees, how to deal with multi-tenancy, security, some opportunities for some new to better support some new distributed applications like distributed learning. If you go to the next slide, and I have no idea how this will look because this was supposed to be all the way on the left-hand side. Okay, it somehow happens. This work is driven in the context of many different use cases. So we've looked at a number of different applications from CDNs, which I mentioned, to AR/VR. We've looked at analytics applications that are just purely on IoT type of sensing data, sort of small data sizes, with small data sizes, to visual computing, where maybe the sensors are cameras. And then we've also, we've realized that if you go to the next slide, we've realized that all of these open source technologies and specs are available as, everybody that's trying to build a real system, whether it's for a production system, or just an experimental framework, we know that this is a major versionitis. So we've also put in a lot of effort to kind of automate this process. And we've using modern technologies like Kubernetes and Docker containers on commodity servers. We've kind of build this infrastructure for what we call Mac in a box, and you can just kind of build to have your currently, as I said, we don't have access to open source 5G licenses, so this is 4G based. But we can build easily a 4G network containerized with Mac infrastructure. And we've also worked on some of the applications, like if you take the Apache Traffic Control CDN, that's not just a single executable, it's many components, and just running that in this network is not trivial. You have to do a lot of things. So we've put in a lot of effort to automate that process. I'm happy to talk more about the various efforts, but I just want to have just one slide to acknowledge the work that a lot of the students in my group have put in this effort, and all the different sponsors that are helping us in this process. So thank you.
So next, we'd like to introduce Julie Walker. Julie, if you'd like to give your presentation.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate being included in this presentation today. As I look at the title of this, Democratizing Connectivity, I do think about public libraries because we are often referred to as the most democratic of institutions. In Georgia, we have 408 public libraries, at least one in every county. And we have, of course, high-speed internet access in every single one of those. We were the first state in the country to have broadband access in every single public library. And that's so important because our public libraries can provide support for their communities in education, research, public service, government, economic development. So much of the work that all of our communities do can be facilitated through your public library. And in many counties in Georgia, of course, the public library is the only place where there is free public Wi-Fi and public internet access in the county, especially in some of our rural areas. And certainly with the emergence of COVID-19, our libraries have had to shift to the way they do business, but I've been incredibly proud of how quickly they pivoted to providing as much Wi-Fi access as possible outside the walls of their buildings when their buildings were closed. They left their Wi-Fi on, they took the password protection off. Our office quickly put together a map of all the locations where public library Wi-Fi was available in parking lots, along with a link at every one of those locations for the public to be able to apply for virtual library cards for use during this time when the library buildings were closed. So libraries have been doing their part in several different ways over the course of the years, but I wanted to talk to you today about one specific pilot project that we have done in our library system based in Milledgeville, Georgia, the Twin Lakes Library System, on TV white space, which is over-the-air broadband that's really incredibly useful for rural libraries. So we can go to the next slide, please. What is TV white space? I will confess it took me a long time to get my head around what TV white space is, but white space is the unused spectrum on the UHF and VHF broadcast spectrum. So there's unused bandwidth that can be freely used to provide Wi-Fi. So TV white space requires a base radio and client radios, and in flat areas, the range can be up to 6 miles. It can actually move through even buildings, especially if the terrain is fairly flat. And so in Milledgeville, they were able to have really nice speed, even though they still had some moderate influence in their area from the Atlanta TV stations. I will say that this was a grant that was provided by the Federal Institute for Museums and Library Services that allowed Milledgeville to do this, and I want to talk a little bit about what they did. So if we can go to the next slide, please. There were a number of benefits to public libraries for considering this technology, and since the success of the Milledgeville project, we have a number of our rural libraries looking at this and seeking funding to try to implement this in their areas. We have excellent speed at all of our public libraries. We've worked very hard from our central office to assist libraries in utilizing federal E-rate funding to get the maximum broadband speed they can for all of their users. So the speed that already exists is sufficient to add TV white space to what they're doing. We can't, as many as our 408 public libraries are, and as broadly spread out as they are, we can't reach every single neighborhood. And so TV white space allows the libraries to get to new areas, and often those are underserved areas where there is not a library building. For example, in Milledgeville, the TV white space signal reaches their entire greenway, all of their public parks, and many of their walking trails. This can also be a backup and has been used in parts of the country during emergencies when cell networks were inoperable. And as we have learned this year, emergencies can and will happen. This does also add a value to the public resources because these stations can be added at public parks, at swimming pools, at community centers, at after-school programs, so that the taxpayers, the students, all the families in those areas can have access to the internet in places where before it was not available. So if we could go to the next slide, please. So just a timeline at Twin Lakes, just to give you an idea, they applied for the grant and received it in 2007. And as their just a little bit humorous comment here, it did take a couple of years to work with the vendor to get this going. So really, the equipment was not installed until April of 19. Configured and finalized in May, so it has been up since then, and they've been live since then. So we can go to the next slide, please. So far, their peak usage has been about 2,500 connections per month, which is great. This is the base station that's atop their the Mary Vinson Library, which is their central library in downtown Milledgeville. And then the next slide shows, I believe, the other piece of it, the client radio unit, which is at the Oconee Greenway on a light pole there. So the folks at the Twin Lakes Library System in Milledgeville have been absolutely delighted with the success of this project, despite the fact that it took a little while to get going. And they've graciously shared these slides with us because they have been spreading the word and talking to other library systems around the state about the benefits of this and how easy it really was. It's an inexpensive adaptation. It's estimated between $15,000 and $25,000 to cover a county, just depending on the size and how many of these client radio units you have. And that includes the equipment, the installation, and the maintenance. Ongoing maintenance is very, very minimal. So this really is a cost-effective solution to broadcast library Wi-Fi to further corners of the county. And I think I may have one more slide to go, please. So Twin Lakes is looking for additional funding to have a base unit that is mobile, not fixed on top of the library, but in some kind of a mobile unit so that they can move to events around their county and around their service area. More and more vendors are getting into this space so that we can improve hardware to increase the bandwidth. And there are several government, local and state government agencies and vendors who are getting interested in this technology to address the digital divide and who are looking forward to working with us. We do actually have a grant in to try to do a couple more pilots, and we are pursuing additional funding because we feel like this is a wonderful solution for the many, many rural areas in our state who need this so much right now while there is a deficiency of broadband. So with that, I will have, and I think perhaps on my very last slide there is a link, and if there's not, I will be glad to share it. Yes. The link at the very bottom that's labeled overview video is just a really great, very simple explanation of TV white space. And I think it helped me more than anything to get my head around exactly what this meant. But I do have these additional resources and look forward to any questions you have at the end of the presentations. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Next, I'd like to welcome Ellen Zegura.
Thank you, Greg, and thanks very much to everyone involved in the Smart Cities and Inclusive Innovation program. I think this is a really valuable series, and I appreciate being invited to take part. I don't have slides, so I'll try to, that usually leads to talking a little less, so try to leave us some time, a good amount of time for some Q&A. So I'm faculty in the School of Computer Science at Georgia Tech. Ada and I have, at least when we're on campus, offices just a few doors down from one another. My primary background is networking, computer networking. So we we have fairly complementary areas of interest and some overlaps in our areas. I guess what I want to do is talk about a couple of efforts I've been involved in, which I would say are amongst the most challenging in terms of democratizing access. So over the last 4 years or so, I've worked with collaborators based in Southern California and Arizona and New Mexico now on connectivity on Native American reservations. So a partnership with a collection of tribes in Southern California initially, and more recently several pueblos in the New Mexico area north of Santa Fe. And I didn't know this before I started this work, so probably a few of you would know it. I mean, the Native American reservations are really the last frontier for access, and I'm talking about low data rate access, not even broad, high data rate access. The last frontier in the United States. They share, in many cases, the same challenges of rural communities, as Julie so well outlined, but they also are more complicated in some ways than rural communities, and that's because the governance structure of tribes has to that overlays with federal and FCC governance and U.S. government governance, and so you end up with a really fairly complex socio-technical system when you look at access on Native American reservations. These are often very rural. The topography is challenging. Julie referred to some of the issues with the way in which that can affect how well a solution like TV whitespace applies. And there are other issues that, as technologists, we sometimes don't bring to the fore, but my collaborations have included a social scientist. This democratization is a social word, right? Is not a technical word, really. And so issues of, is it the content? Is it the right content? So the digital divide, rather than being kind of a very binary black and white thing, there are a number of nuances that have to do with the type of content available and the ways that people can interact with that content, and is it appropriate culturally, and a set of issues in that area. So I have a TV whitespace story as well. We had success working with a tribally owned ISP in Southern California to extend their network using TV whitespace technology to some homes that had not previously been reachable from their wireless LAN. When we went to do the same thing in New Mexico, and this is with National Science Foundation funding under the Smart and Connected Communities program, we thought, okay, it's New Mexico, right? This is a relatively low population state in the United States. And we sent some initial coordinates to Six Harmonics, which is one of the TV whitespace vendors that we had worked with before. And we got an email back saying, something's going on here. I don't see any free channels. So you can only use TV whitespace means you can use spectrum that previously was reserved for television stations, provided there are no television stations using that spectrum. So you have to be careful that you're operating on channels that are not being used. So we get this email back, something strange here. There aren't, and you have to have 3 consecutive channels. I'm not seeing much available. Los Alamos ? So turns out that radio telemetry and Los Alamos, we think, had reserved a number, essentially almost all of the TV band. And so despite being in a very unpopulated area, it looked, at least for a while, like TV whitespace was not going to be an option. We ended up, I didn't do this work, I've heard it was quite painful, applying to the FCC for an exception in order to get a sort of experimental license with a 6-month time window to it, which is, of course, suitable for research purposes, but not suitable for long-term connectivity. So I tell this story both to add to Julie's two cycles of the Earth. These technologies can be bleeding edge. They're exciting because they have properties. Their physical properties are so appealing for trying to extend access where more traditional methods of extending access have just, aren't doing it. Basically, aren't doing it. Let me talk about one other thing, which is I have been quite involved in characterizing and synthesizing data sets and doing our own measurements of connectivity in the New Mexico area and in some rural parts of Georgia. We've benefited from a relationship with a company called Skyhook, which provides location services and has cell tower and Wi-Fi data, and much of it crowdsourced. And so we have worked on a better understanding of where there are connectivity issues in the United States, which turns out to be not a trivial problem. So providers have to tell the FCC about their coverage, their cellular coverage, but the models that they use are not fully accurate. I think they know that, but they're not. And so there are areas that the FCC, for instance, reports as covered that are not covered. Doesn't usually go the other way around. And so we've been taking these Skyhook data sets and FCC data sets, and then some crowdsourced community data sets, and using those to build maps of coverage and places where we're pretty confident that things are covered, that coverage exists, places where we're quite sure it doesn't, and then places where if you wanted to really nail that down, you would need to go do some measurements. So how do we construct, say, targeted measurement campaigns to increase our understanding of where we have coverage and where we don't? And so that's been an interesting direction where there's really been a gap in understanding at a detailed level what the coverage looks like. On Tuesday, I went hiking with a couple of students in North Georgia, and we did data collection on the trail. So we have been extending work, trying to do work locally that sort of models some of the things we might see if we were in the New Mexico setting, but something that we can drive to and that we can drive to regularly. And so we have a project that has to do with monitoring and characterizing trail level cellular connectivity with a motivation around safety, around hiker safety. So I think I'll stop here and turn things back over to Greg to open up the Q&A.
Thanks so much, Ellen. So we're going to go to our next section. Welcome Sokwoo Rhee from NIST, and he'll be moderating a panel discussion and Q&A. Sokwoo, I just unmuted you. There you go.
Yeah, can you now hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Right, awesome. Thank you, all three of you. There was a great presentations, and I appreciate everybody joining the call. Before I get into Q&A from audience, I want to provide a few icebreakers questions for each of you. So, Ellen, that was a really interesting perspectives, and I understand, and I actually work on that myself too, the lack of connectivity in underserved area. And when I say underserved, a lot of them are rural communities, and a lot of them are tribal communities, and so on. But at the end of the day, the commercial entities like companies are going to have a hard time justifying many of their investment because the density is not as high as they like to. So question is, what can cities and communities to do to identify and adopt and even find technologies that, for example, like white space, and that's a new technology. So they have to figure out what is the reliability, whether it's going to actually even work for their communities. I mean, how would the households we're going to install receivers, which is not going to be the same receiver as anything, so the usual Wi-Fi hotspots that we use. So what should communities and cities do? Obviously, the first answer could be apply for federal funding, but let's get out of the funding cushion for now, because you need to, do something even before applying for funding.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and it actually points out some of the additional barriers to connectivity that may not be purely technical and might instead have to do with things like the skill set and available people available who understand enough about networking and network management to be able to keep networks up and running in these communities. And I mean, you're absolutely right, of course, that a big challenge with rural areas is this populations are so sparse that the business case is not there for the providers to move into those areas. And the federal government absolutely has a role to play in helping those communities get coverage, because if they are left to the mercies of the capital markets, then nothing will change there. So I think there are opportunities for creativity with existing technologies. We are exploring the use of LoRa in LoRa is a low data rate networking technology that's relatively new, has gotten a lot of traction for Internet of Things, but we are exploring using it as a messaging platform. This doesn't bring those communities up to a common standard, but I do think creativity is in the use of technologies that are available is an important piece. The mobile, setting up mobile TV white space based access is another example of a form of creativity. I think most TV white space engineers initially did not have the idea that you'd be carrying it around on a bus or a truck. Those kinds of things are really necessary, because bridging these gaps is incredibly challenging. So I guess my answer is, some creativity, some of that's going to come from researchers. Actually, a lot of it's probably going to come from researchers who are able to think outside the box. But there's also an issue of network management and training, and are there people? So when we work with this, tribal-owned ISP in Southern California, they are running on an unbelievably lean staff, and the same people have to write the grant proposals. They have to go out and figure out why the receiver isn't receiving. They have to go to a tribal council meeting and explain, the relationship of the technology to the land, sacred land. I mean, it's, one person basically is doing all of these things. So there's a kind of training skills component as well.
Right. Oh, that's a great answer. Julie, next question is to you. Many participants may not know the role of public libraries in terms of providing internet access to a lot of the community areas. I know that you already talked about it a little bit, but especially I'm interested in hearing the roles that you are playing recently, especially in the wake of this crisis. And actually, it's not just you. I'm hearing a lot of different places, a lot of different communities saying public library playing a critical role in filling up the gap, at least temporarily. So give me a little bit of your perspectives and what you are doing on that front.
Certainly, I would be happy to do that, because I'm so proud of all of our 408 public libraries and how quickly they have swung into action to completely change the way they do business while their doors are locked. I will say that they are gradually reopening right now. About 80% of them are doing some level of service, whether it's porch pickup or curbside service. About 25% are completely back open and running, and their computers that are inside the library are available, as well as their Wi-Fi inside and outside. But all of them throughout this crisis have had their Wi-Fi available in their parking lots, free of passwords, so that anyone could come. And especially in those first few months when students were trying so hard to complete remote learning, that became, obviously it's not ideal to sit in your car and try to do your homework or write a paper with parking lot Wi-Fi, but it was what was available in some communities. And I think those of us who live in more urban areas, more populated areas, are familiar with so many other places that you can get free Wi-Fi, from Starbucks to McDonald's. But in some of our rural communities, that's just not a possibility, and the public library is the place. And the photographs that I saw of parking lots being filled up were absolutely amazing. For example, in Tolliver County, which is one of the poorest counties in the state of Georgia, they only have a population of 1,700 people, and their Wi-Fi was used 450 times in the first 30 days that they were closed. So that's an incredible amount of use. Another thing that's not quite connectivity, but I just want to mention because I thought it was a wonderful service. My agency is part of the University System of Georgia. We're one of the units of the Board of Regents Central Office. And we learned that so many of the university students, when they suddenly did not return to campus after spring break, got home not only without internet, but also without any kind of a device. And they were trying to finish college work on their cell phones. Our libraries have long loaned out laptops, Chromebook laptops. So we contacted those libraries who offered that service and asked if they would be willing to do just one-on-one service if the university system identified, for example, a Georgia Tech student who had to go home and had no device to do her work, and we could connect her with a close-by library and they could do a handoff of a Chromebook. And the AJC even did an article about it because it was just really heartwarming that the student said, you know, you saved my semester because you were able to offer me both Wi-Fi in the parking lot and a machine to do my work on. So public libraries are always trying to figure out what their communities need and how best they can meet those needs. And they try to really stay ahead of the tech curve. We do something out of our office called Tech Loaner Kits, where we put together new devices, everything from 3D printers to virtual reality kits, and loan them out to the libraries so that they can do community programming, so that people who have never been able to get their hands on technology like that are able to try it out and see if it's something that would be useful to them. I think the partnership what Ellen was speaking of about how much research this is going to take to come up with creative solutions. It's a great partnership with public libraries because our colleagues at the university system are such experts in this type of research. And then we're on the ground in every county in Georgia, and we can help implement those solutions as they come forward. So we're really happy with that. We see our role in the educational structure of the state, especially now, I think, in workforce development as well. So libraries are standing ready, and we're always ready to pivot and do what we need to do to help all of our communities. So I'm really happy to have been part of this.
That's an amazing story. I know that public libraries are playing it's a critical role in a lot of crises, but it's great to hear from these examples. So one thing that this crisis revealed is the importance of connectivity. And to some extent, there is a lack of connectivity in certain areas. When you have a connectivity issue to watch Netflix, that's one thing. But when you have a connectivity issue, when you need to do telework or distance learning, that's a completely different question. And that brings it up to the level of that's almost extremely important as just like any other resources that we usually take. So I actually have a few questions on the line, which I'm going to get to that after I ask one question to Ada. So Ada, a little more technical questions. It's about 5G. So a 5G is here. When I say here, some countries are already adopting it and pushing it forward, but it's still not clear what will be the exact killer app for the immediate future. I mean, we talk about autonomous vehicles, and that probably is going to be I don't know, 10 years away to really get to the point that it's going to be widely adopted. We've been talking about AR, VR, but that progress in that industry seems to be slow. So what would be the driver to adopt the 5G? And one of the skeptical colleagues to tell me, essentially, handset manufacturers would have stopped manufacturing 4G handsets. They're going to all go to 5G handsets and going to force us to adopt 5G, regardless whether we want to pay for it or not. So what is your perspective about, so what is going to be the killer app, and what is going to be the transition from 4G to 5G like?
I think that what we've seen as a trend, I think throughout history of technology in terms of how we transition from one technology to another, it's unfortunately never a sort of an easy jump from one technology to the next, right? So I don't think that this is going to be any different. There are going to be verticals that will have demands, the different contexts, that will have sufficient demand for 5G-like use cases, such as the ones that you mentioned, and that will drive the deployment. We have to have the deployment to have the adoption. The adoption needs to be clear for the deployment to happen. So I think that different countries based on their, and different providers based on their sort of strategies on going to market and being competitive with what that requires may come up with different solutions. I mean, I don't want to, I haven't done analysis myself, so this is sort of quoting reports on what is the speculation within the next couple of years, what are the countries that will be ahead of the curve in terms of adoption, where is it going to be, and sort of best case scenarios are putting at 20%, less than a handful of countries. Right. So, I think that there isn't going to be so what that tells me is that there isn't a clear image of a single killer app that's going to have global impact in order to for us to see numbers that are putting us at much bigger percentage, much more equally distributed globally. But is it going to make a huge difference in some scenarios and for some applications, for some industry verticals? Absolutely. Is it going to help change some of the problems or the extent of the problems that we're seeing today? Absolutely. I think what's more important is that, I think that one thing of going to, having the availability of the next technologies, what that does to the currently available technologies. And I think that, I would expect that LTE would become cheaper, more accessible, right? Because that's that's what's not going to comply the competitive edge. And I think, one of the things that I talked about all of these open source solutions, I mean, this is, providers are not selling just to consumers. There are all of these enterprise solutions that are critical, like enterprise LTE networks. And I think that that's what's driving a lot of the open source solutions. And so from that creates an availability of building blocks for different types of communities to be able to find sufficiently skilled technical help among more of the general IT population, as opposed to having to go and recruit out of AT&T to have somebody that will be able to build, to know how to build and manage a network, right? If you have broader open source initiatives around LTE software stacks or mobile network software stacks, that's bringing in a community, a very broad community of expertise that can be then more easily shared, communicated, training, getting help, and that can help with some of the problems that that Ellen mentioned in terms of how are you going to build these solutions. I think that that's going to become easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. When we created internet at first in 1960s, nobody really envisions having Netflix or Facebook and Googles of the world. So it's sometimes chicken and egg problem, but sometimes whatever comes out first, we're gonna have following impact. So that's great. Now I'm gonna go through the questions that came up with the chat box. First question is from Catherine Moore. How does this current issue of infrastructure/technology access compare to the electrification of rural America in terms of importance imperative for government investment? So this is, and I heard this question before, this is really comparing this broadband access to utility, the electricity access. So I don't want to answer the question. I'm a vet, so I'm going to leave that to you guys. So anyone who want to take on this question? Alan, you raise your hand.
I think the connection is strong. I mean, in order to get electrification across the U.S., it required a significant investment and commitment on the part of the federal government. And I think the analogy is an apt one. So and impaired, I'm not sure we're at a point the same kind of, well, I'm sure we're not at the same kind of point with respect to a kind of willingness on the part of the federal government to make that investment. But in my mind, the kind of imperative is quite similar.
Ada, you wanted to say something?
So, especially sort of these last few months have really pointed to the fact that, this is a utility. This is a core utility that's just as critical as any of the other utilities that we have to make sure we sort of equalize their availability across the country. I think that there are a lot of countries that can serve as an example of what is achievable. Right, and so I think that should provide some information. I also want to go back to one comment that Sokwoo, you said, that connectivity is not binary, right? And so that means, and that particular I think is critical, that this is not just about allowing bits to trickle from a device to a backend base station, or you need enough, whether it's to make sure you deliver the right content that connects with the community, or to actually with the right bit rate, the right response rate, in order to provide that service. And if you don't, then you haven't solved the problem. And so I think that somehow that's very important to capture to have adequate metrics for connectivity when.
Exactly. It's not about bit rate. It's not just about data rate. It's about the holistic solution to deliver the service that needs to be delivered. So I think that we have another question from the chat window from Rodney Martin. So this is probably directed to Julie. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the technical connection between TV white space and Wi-Fi connectivity? I think I had the same question. Let's say you have a TV white space station, but at the end of the day, the residents should be able to access this through Wi-Fi. How does that work? Julie?
I'm hoping that I can defer this to Ellen, because I think she's got a lot more expertise in this than I do. I'm much more on the end user end than the back end.
All right, Ellen, then.
Yeah, okay, I'm happy to jump in. So, I mean, here's the way to think about it. The TV white space link is what gets you the long distance, but then that comes to a device that acts like a Wi-Fi access point. So the users, they think they're using they are using Wi-Fi. It's just that to get from where they are back into the network, it happens to use this TV white space technology to make that happen. So they're in that way, they're compatible. And just think of it as sort of the long link versus what you use to get into that long link.
So TV Wi-Fi is just a backhaul. Basically, that's the answer here. Okay, so we only have a couple of minutes. So I'm going to give 30 seconds to each of you to finish up. I want to really look at the inequality of the access problem, because it's not just rural versus urban. I was talking to one of the CTOs of largest cities in the United States, and then I talked about, okay, the urban areas should have a better access of broadband, and he says that's not necessarily true. There are certain areas in urban cities that do not have enough broadband access either. So, I mean, it's not just urban versus rural problem. It's about access availability for underserved population. So, Ellen, I'm going to start with you very briefly, 30 seconds.
Okay. I was hoping there might be a few more questions in the chat, but maybe people are happy to listen to what we have to say without asking questions. So let me just say, I think this is an incredible. I've always felt it was an incredibly important issue. The times we're in now, it's just undeniable that it verges on a right that people have access, because if they don't, they are the disparities in opportunity are just so great, and more than opportunity, in health, in education. It's not just is there something good I can do? It's really about a level of thriving. And I'd be happy to chat with anyone on the group who might want to email me. Thank you, Greg. Appreciate it.
All right, Julie, your 30 seconds.
Thank you. Public libraries are ultimately about leveling the playing field and trying to equalize the haves and the have-nots. And I think Ellen is exactly correct. This verges on our right now, and we see the needs out there, everything from telemedicine to e-government services, applying for jobs, even using what a lot of people are using right now since they can't get their hands on physical books. Now everybody is wanting e-books. There are so many things, certainly in the education realm, certainly in remote learning at all levels, from kindergarten through graduate school. I'm seeing it all right now, and the needs that people have that are coming to their libraries. But this connectivity is the common thread through there, and we're trying to do our best to help to level that playing field in every corner of Georgia and in every corner of this country. But it is a tremendous need, and it has only gotten more pronounced in the last 3 months.
That's awesome. Ada, 30 seconds.
So I think, it's both Ellen and I talked about, there are a lot of exciting projects that are ongoing on thinking of new solutions to connectivity problems, whether it's to just sort of bear enabling that connectivity or enabling it to deal with new application requirements, new usage requirements. And so one of the things that is non-trivial for us to do from the academic research side is to get access to real data, to link with kind of real users. Ellen has had fantastic success in that, but it's a extremely labor-intensive process to get to that point, and so we love those opportunities. So I don't know the names. I don't know who is who on the participants list, but if there are any of you that can identify for yourselves as potentially end user, that maybe you have a concrete problem, you have data, Julie, I'd love to follow up with you with a little bit more information on what were those 453 users doing, or what are those 1,700 users. So we need that kind of information to really inform what are the real problems that we need to work on in order to make sure that we deliver the right kind of connectivity solution. So
that's great. I'm sure we can go on like this for 3 more hours if you want to. This is really awesome group of speakers and great questions. But time is up. So I really appreciate all speakers to participate, all the attendees and who've been listening to this. I very much appreciate it, and hopefully we can have another time next that we can continue this discussion. Greg, back to you.
Thanks so much, Sokwoo. Thanks everyone, Ada, Julie, Ellen. Great presentations, great discussion, very engaging. We really appreciate you for coming on our webinar today and interacting. Thank you to all our attendees for attending today's webinar. I do want to make you aware that we do have 3 more lined up. So every Thursday this month in June, our next webinar here at Smarter Together is on June 11th. It's going to be the digital divide during a global pandemic and beyond. That's going to be another panel type discussion. And then on June 18th, the topic is cybersecurity and privacy in the age of remote working. So another COVID-related type of panel discussion. And then on June 25th, the topic is community insights, incite community action. So very looking forward to those 3 upcoming webinars. And thank you all for attending today. That concludes today's presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Great.
okay.
Bye-bye.